Greetings, taxable assets, or should I say, collateral damage. You are listening to what is ostensibly a deep dive into tabletop strategy, but let us strip away the civilian pleasantries immediately. This is an internal Departmento Analytica audit. I am the senior auditor, and I am currently staring at a mountain of sheer, unadulterated logistical heresy. I have just poured my fourth cup of this vile engine runoff recap just to stomach what sits on my metal desk right now. The civilian contractors over at the channel Play on Tabletop have submitted a catastrophic action report. They have titled this Gloss-Brained Theater. Can the Astra Militarum escape the Tyranid swarm? I will be cross-referencing this unmitigated disaster with our own internal document, Tactical Geometry and Mathematical Attrition in the Leviathan Crusade. You, the invisible overseer, the junior adept listening in on this Vox channel, I want you to open the ledger right now because the numbers in this report are nothing short of a financial crime and someone is going to pay the tithe for it. Proceed with the summary, servitor, and please, for the love of the Emperor, do not waste my time.
Right away, Senior Auditor. And if I may say, while I understand your administrative frustration, the narrative premise of this Play on Tabletop engagement is actually quite fascinating from a purely historical perspective. What we are looking at is a recreation of a desperate rearguard action. Several different Astra Militarum Guard regiments have been pushed back to their absolute last line of defense. The premise is that these human forces are attempting to retreat across a highly contested, hostile planet, running from an unending wave of Tyranid alien hordes. They don't have to win a standard military victory. They just need to survive the meat grinder and escape to the far edge of the battlefield. It's a classic cinematic setup.
Stop. Stop speaking immediately. Cinematic. Desperate. The fact that your servitor cortex allows you to process this spatial asphyxiation trap as a heroic narrative proves that the mechanicus built you from defective biomass. Let me make something abundantly clear to you and to the listener at home who might be swayed by this civilian propaganda. There are no heroes in a negative ledger. There is only geometry, and there is mathematical attrition. When you allow narrative to dictate your tactical deployment, you have already lost the war. Let us begin Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this audit, the asymmetrical mission and spatial asphyxiation. Read the exact objective parameters from the contractor's report, just the facts. Read them and tell me if you still think this is a cinematic triumph.
Well, looking at the raw data slate here, the Play on Tabletop report states, and I quote the Guard Commander directly, "I don't start with a single model on the table. There are no standard objective markers in the middle of the board. There are no secondary tactical objectives to score points dynamically. There is only a 6-inch deployment zone on one short edge of the board. And the sole objective, the only way to score victory points, is to run across the entire length of the board to a 12-inch escape zone on the far side by turn 5.
I'm staring at the flame of my lighter right now, genuinely wishing it could burn away the sheer incompetence of this mission structure. You see, what the civilian contractor calls a narrative throwback, the Departmento Analytica categorizes as forced linearity bankruptcy. To put that in layman's terms for the junior adepts listening, they box themselves in. This is not a mission. It is a geometric asphyxiation trap. When you play a standard game, you have multiple ways to win. You can hold the center, you can flank, you can score secondary points by performing actions. Here, the scoring mechanism is a profane asymmetry.
I see what you mean about the asymmetry. The Tyranid player, the Xenos, scores victory points strictly by destroying the Guard units. They get points for liquidating points costed biomass. But the Guard, they only score points by preserving their units, specifically keeping them above half strength and getting them entirely within that 12-inch escape zone on the opposite side of the table.
Exactly. And geometrically, this restricts the human commanding officer to an absolute, predictable vector. They must funnel their entire mass, all their tanks, all their infantry through a terrain-choked board, effectively reducing their maneuverability to 0. When your opponent knows exactly where you have to go and exactly when you have to be there, you are not playing a tactical game anymore. You are walking to a meat grinder. Now, verify the assets. What exactly did these commanders bring to this doomed endeavor? Read the roster for both sides. Let's see how much capital was squandered here.
The Tyranid forces, commanded by Contractor Nick, brought what they call all big bugs all the time. This is the Crusher Stampede paradigm. We are talking about maximum biological density. He deployed the Swarm Lord, multiple Norn emissaries, including one affectionately or perhaps mockingly named Tickle several exocrines for heavy artillery, a neurotyrant for psychic disruption, and a pack of screamer killers.
High-value, high-toughness assets. Pure monstrous synergy. And the Astra Militarum. What did Contractor JT bring to counter this wall of alien muscle?
The Guard brought a mechanized assault detachment. This includes a massive super heavy tank, Penelope the Shadowsword. It also includes Hamilton the Vanquisher, a Rogaldorn battle tank, and multiple chimeras acting as armored transports for their squishy infantry squads.
Do you understand the financial cynicism of what you just read to me? Let's break this down for the listener so they understand the sheer magnitude of this error. The Tyranids invested entirely in high-toughness stat checks. For those unfamiliar with the tabletop mechanics, a Norn emissary or a screamer killer boasts a toughness stat so high that standard infantry weapons like lasguns, heavy bolters, mathematically cannot hurt them in any meaningful way. It requires dedicated, high-strength anti-tank weaponry to even scratch their carapace. The Xenos brought elite biomatter that projects overwhelming mortal wounds and ignores small arms fire. And what did the Guard commander bring in response?
Well, he brought the Shadowsword. That's a dedicated Titan killer. The Volcano Cannon on that thing is strength 24. It's designed to punch through exactly the kind of high-toughness monsters the Tyranids brought. I mean, in a vacuum, bringing the biggest gun possible to a monster fight seems like a logical escalation, doesn't it?
In a vacuum, perhaps. But we do not fight in a vacuum. We fight on a geometrically confined tabletop. The Guard commander brought a localized failure point. Penelope the Shadowsword is not just a tank, it's a massive point sink. The commander has dumped over 400 points into a single chassis that relies on a mathematically fragile 3+ ballistic skill to validate its existence. It's what I call penny stock violence. You put all your capital into one incredibly volatile asset, and if it fails to perform perfectly every single turn, your entire portfolio collapses. And let us not forget the physical reality of the board. Look at the deployment density. Read the terrain layout described in the report.
The Play on Tabletop board is described as a highly narrative, immersive environment. There are low walls, less than 2 inches tall, scattering the ground, large ruined buildings that completely block line of sight, 2-inch cliffs that must be physically scaled by the models, and a significant amount of decorative greenery and debris. It's meant to look like a ruined planetary defense line.
Decorative greenery. The absolute luxury of civilians to care about foliage when their physical footprint is actively suffocating them. We call this the density-to-area ratio in the Analytica. Consider the physical dimensions of these models. The Guard commander is crammed into a 6-inch deployment zone at the edge of the board. Have you ever physically held a Shadowsword model?
It is quite substantial. It's roughly the size of a standard brick.
It is more than 6 inches long. It physically overwrites the available area of the deployment zone. The commander created a fatal traffic jam of their own armored bulk before the first die was even cast. Imagine trying to park a Baneblade variant, multiple Lehman Russ tanks, a Rogaldorn, and a fleet of chimeras in a space narrower than the vehicles themselves. A 6-inch deployment zone forcing a massive super heavy tank to navigate 2-inch cliffs and sight-blocking ruins while attempting to flee a swarm of monsters. It is logistical suicide. They bankrupt their own movement options before the game even started.
That is an excellent point about the physical logistics. When you choose a heavily mechanized list, you need the space to maneuver those vehicles. If they're bumping into each other, blocking each other's firing lanes, and struggling to pass over basic terrain, their speed advantage is entirely negated, which actually brings us perfectly into Section 2. Turn 1, Phase 3, the vectors of psychosis. Because how the Guard commander deployed that massive 400-point liability is, well, it's quite something.
I can feel a migraine forming behind my right eye already. Tell me, how did Contractor JT deploy the single most important and expensive asset in his entire army?
According to the video evidence in the report, Contractor JT realized the spatial limitation. He looked at the 6-inch deployment zone, looked at his massive tank, and deployed the Shadowsword backwards. Its rear treads facing the enemy, its massive Volcano Cannon pointing toward his own board edge. He justifies it on the record, stating, "This tank is more than 6 inches wide and more than 6 inches long. This looks cool as if he's running away here backwards, holding the defensive line."
I am experiencing physical, skeletal pain at this tactical incompetence. I am diagnosing this right now using the audit's paranoia vector. Listen to me very carefully. This is not looking cool. This is a profound, fundamental misunderstanding of tabletop positioning. This commander is operating out of a localized, paralyzing terror.
To play devil's advocate, Senior Auditor, in older editions of the game, vehicle facing mattered immensely. Rear armor was drastically weaker than front armor. Could this be a calculated risk to protect his vulnerable rear chassis while retreating? Or perhaps he's measuring his distance to the board edge for a faster escape in the subsequent turns.
If this were the 7th edition of the game, I might entertain that archaic logic. But we are auditing a 10th edition engagement. Vehicle facing, in terms of armor values, does not exist in the current physics of this universe. A Shadowsword has a toughness of 13 whether you shoot in the front, the side, or the rear exhaust ports. What does matter is pivoting. By deploying backwards, he has fundamentally compromised his firing arcs and movement vectors. The amount of movement he will have to waste simply rotating that colossal chassis to draw a bead on an approaching Tyranid monster is mathematically sickening.
That makes sense. The pivot tax on a model that size is severe.
Exactly. He has stuck his infantry into chimeras, not for rapid redeployment, not for a mechanized advantage to secure forward positions, but out of absolute unadulterated dread of what the Tyranid blast profiles will do to his soft targets. It is the paranoia vector made manifest. Deploying based on the fear of your opponent's capabilities, rather than deploying to achieve your own win condition. He is so terrified of the Swarm Lord and the Exocrines that he has paralyzed his own army. Now contrast this with the Xenos. How did the Tyranid commander deploy his forces?
Contractor Nick took a very different approach. He deployed his entire force of massive monsters directly on his board edge on turn 1. He didn't put anything into deep strike reserves. He didn't hold anything back for a tactical flank. He just brought them all onto the edge and walked them forward in a massive line. In the report, he enthusiastically described it as a stampede, specifically comparing his advancing monsters to the T-Rex in Jurassic Park.
Jurassic Park. The absolute state of civilian military theory. We define this in the Departmento Analytica as the arrogance vector. And to be clear, it is a justified arrogance.
How so? Usually, putting your entire army on the front line with no reserves is considered tactically blunt. It exposes all your assets to immediate enemy fire. Why is it justified here?
Because the Xenos commander understands the mission parameters better than the human. He deployed a flat, sweeping front line of absolute biomatter density. He is greedily expecting to simply absorb the mathematical variance of the fleeing Astra Militarum armor. Think about it. The Tyranids are projecting artificial exclusion zones merely by existing. For the listener, let me explain threat ranges. A Screamer Killer has a movement characteristic, plus the ability to advance, plus the ability to charge. If you add those distances together, you create a geometric sphere of death around that model. Any human unit that steps inside that invisible bubble is mathematically likely to be charged and torn to pieces.
Ah, I see. So by lining them all up side by side, the Tyranid player creates overlapping spheres of death that cover the entire width of the board.
Precisely. They are denying the very ground the guard must traverse to escape. They are turning the board into a fatal funnel. The Xenos walk forward, arrogance radiating from their carapace, because they know the guard's linear mathematics they're shooting cannot stop the exponential pressure of that advancing wall. The guard must move forward to score. The Tyranids simply have to exist in that forward space to prevent it. It is a masterclass in spatial denial, enabled entirely by the guard's self-inflicted traffic jam.
That spatial denial really comes to a head in the next phase of the report. This brings us to turn 2, the cognitive overload and the probability bypass, phases 4 and B of our audit. Because turn 2 is when the Tyranid commander triggered his faction's defining psychological weapon.
Tell me, what catastrophic failure occurred when the Tyranids triggered the Shadow and the Warp? And explain the mechanic for our junior adepts who might not have faced the hive mind firsthand.
Of course. The Shadow and the Warp is a terrifying once-per-game Tyranid faction ability. When triggered, it forces every single enemy unit on the board to immediately take a battle shock test. It's essentially a massive, army-wide morale check. If a unit fails this test, they become terrified. They can't hold objectives, and more importantly for the guard, they cannot be targeted by stratagems. According to the report, when Contractor Nick triggered this on turn 2, the guard line buckled. Hamilton the Vanquisher, the Lemon Rust battle tank, and several of the Chimeras completely failed their battle shock tests. Contractor JT actually noted it out loud, saying only the Vanquisher and the remaining squad passed. Well, that sucks. Wait, let me correct my data slate. He actually clarified that the Vanquisher passed, but the standard Lemon Rust failed.
Well, that sucks. That is the civilian analysis of a complete tactical collapse. That sucks. Let me explain phasey fashion asymmetry to you, since the civilian contractors seem to think this is just a minor inconvenience akin to dropping a piece of toast. The Astra Militarum, as an army, scales linearly. We are an army of flat mathematics. A Lemon Rust fires its battle cannon. Its math is flat, predictable, and frankly mediocre. It hits on a 4+, it is a coin flip. To exceed that linear output, the guard requires the hyperdynamic tether of an officer's order.
Right, the voice of command rule. An officer can yell, "Take aim" to improve their ballistic skill, or "Move, move, move" to increase their speed. It's the core synergy of the entire army.
Exactly. Without those orders, the guard army operates at roughly 60% efficiency. The Tyranids, however, use an exponential psychological mechanic to sever those very command tethers. The Shadow and the Warp hits the entire board simultaneously. When that Lemon Rust failed its battle shock test, it didn't just get scared, it became mathematically isolated. You cannot issue an order to a battle shock unit. A Lemon Rust without the take-aim order is just an overpriced tractor with a metal pipe attached to the turret. It is completely useless. The commander's ability to coordinate a fighting retreat was mathematically severed in an instant. And before I continue, I must interject. This recap is intolerable. I'm sorry. I know we're in the middle of a critical audit, but this tastes like someone strained promethium runoff through a plague rat's belt. And the ventilation fan in this sector. Listen to it. It's absolutely deafening. I am forced to scream over the sound of failing infrastructure while simultaneously auditing failing military infrastructure. The irony is suffocating. And do not even get me started on the cost of quill ink in this department. It costs more than a frontline guardsman's life to requisition a single vial of standard black ink from the Munitorum. I am surrounded by sheer, unadulterated incompetence at every level of the Empire. And I know you, yes, you, the civilian listeners, sitting comfortably in your climate-controlled hab block. I know exactly what you are thinking. You think you can audit better than me. You think you understand the tabletop geometry better than the Departmento Analytica. You probably play casual games on the weekend and think you're a tactical genius. Go ahead, leave a comment down below correcting my spatial geometry, I dare you. Let's see your math. Show me your pathetic little spreadsheet calculations. Try to justify to me why a backwards-facing shadow sword in a 6-inch deployment zone is actually a secret meta strategy. I will wait. I will eagerly await your peer-reviewed defense of absolute stupidity.
Senior Auditor, please. Your biometrics, your blood pressure monitors are blinking red on my console. If I may gently steer us back to the report. The tactical breakdown you were giving regarding the Shadow and the Warp was spot on, but the Tyranid commander actually layered another effect on top of it. He utilized a neurotyrant model to actively manipulate those battle shock tests.
I am perfectly calm. My anger is strictly professional. It is the anger of a man who cares about the ledger. But yes, you are correct to bring up the neurotyrant. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. This is what we call the multivariable trap. Explain how the neurotyrant alters the math.
The neurotyrant has an aura and an ability that essentially subtracts 1 from the leadership characteristic of enemy units taking that Shadow in the Warp test. It actively makes the test harder to pass, so a guard unit that normally passes on a roll of 7 or higher now needs an 8 or higher. It significantly skews the probability bell curve toward failure.
Precisely. And the Tyranid commander used this to cause what I call cognitive overload in the human player. By forcing simultaneous, mathematically disadvantaged battle shock tests across the entire army at the exact moment they need to coordinate a desperate escape, the Tyranid player exhausts the human commander's mental bandwidth. The geographic fork becomes impossible for a panicked mind to process.
Geographic fork? You mean having to choose between multiple bad options?
Yes. The guard commander looks at the board. Half his army is battle-shocked. The Norn emissary is bearing down on his left flank. A screamer killer is about to breach his right flank. His orders are failing. This multivariable processing causes a cascade of poor decision-making. Specifically, the guard commander begins to split fire inefficiently. It is a macro error rooted directly in neural attrition. Because he is terrified of all the approaching threats, he tries to address all of them at once. He starts shooting the heavy bolters from a tank at one target, the main cannon at another, and a last cannon at a third.
Oh, right. Spreading the damage around. In tabletop terms, that's almost always a mistake, isn't it? You usually want to focus fire to completely remove a unit from the board, rather than leaving 3 units alive with just a few wounds taken. A monster with 1 wound remaining deals exactly the same amount of damage in melee as a monster at full health.
Exactly. Achieving nothing but mathematical dilution. He is lightly tickling 3 different apocalyptic threats instead of liquidating one of them to clear an escape vector. Which brings us inevitably to the absolute nadir of this entire engagement, the moment the ledger truly bled out. Section 4. The Crucible Phase. The auditing of the Volcano Cannon. Phase 6. Read the climax of the shooting phase. Read it exactly as they cheered it in their gloss-brained video.
Yes, Senior Auditor. The situation is dire. The Tyranid monsters are closing in. The guard commander finally lines up Penelope the Shadowsword. He aims its massive Volcano Cannon at one of the primary Tyranid monsters. He rolls his dice to determine the number of shots. The D3+1 mechanic yields him 3 shots in total. He then rolls to hit. He says on camera, unfortunately only hitting on 4s. I missed them all. Wait, no, I hit twice. Then he moves to the wound step. He rolls his 2 dice. He rolls a 1 and a 5. Only 1 wound goes through. The Tyranid player rolls his invulnerable save and fails it, but because only 1 shot made it through the sequence, the monster survives the damage. Contractor JT says, well, that was very disappointing. I'd be hilariously tickled pink if I did at least 1 damage. He sounds completely deflated.
I am taking a long, slow, agonizing sip of this abhorrent recap. Let me completely strip the excitement, the thrill, the narrative tension away from this moment with cold, profane mathematics. This was the absolute focal point of the engagement. The entire guard strategy hinged on this single activation. The guard commander required a singular catastrophic damage spike to liquidate a heavy Xenos asset and physically clear the escape vector. Instead, his 400-point super heavy failed to convert his point value into physical biomass liquidation. It is an auditor's nightmare.
It was certainly a tense moment to watch, but was it really mathematically doomed? He rolled 3 shots, hit twice. That doesn't seem like terrible luck on the surface. Didn't the dice just betray him at the very end?
The dice betrayed him. That is the cry of the ignorant gambler. Allow me to translate the exact mathematical proof from the tactical geometry report to prove why this commander was operating on a fundamentally flawed premise from the moment he drafted his roster. Listen closely, because I will not repeat the syllabus, and I want the listeners to understand why relying on single massive guns is a tactical trap. Let us break down the sequence, step by agonizing step. First, the shots. He generated 3 shots. Now, the hit roll. Because the Shadow in the Warp severed his officer's ability to issue the take-aim order, the Shadowsword is firing at its base ballistic skill of 4+. For our junior adepts, a 4+ means you have to roll a 4, 5, or 6 on a 6-sided die to hit the target. That is a 50% probability. It is a literal coin flip.
Okay, so with 3 shots, flipping 3 coins, you'd mathematically expect 1.5 of them to hit, half of 3.
Correct. The expected number of hits is exactly 1.5. The commander rolled exactly 2 hits. That is a slight positive variance. He actually beat the math at this stage. He should have been grateful. But then we arrive at the bottleneck, the wound step. The Volcano Cannon is strength 24. It is one of the most powerful weapons in the galaxy. The target Tyranid monster is toughness 11 or 12. Because the strength of the weapon is more than double the toughness of the target, the required wound roll is a 2+. You only fail on a 1.
A 2+ to wound is fantastic odds. That's roughly an 83% chance of success per die. So with 2 hits, you'd expect, well, almost all of them to wound.
You would expect 1.66 wounds. The commander rolled a 1 and a 5. He suffered a failure. Now, people look at a 1 on a 6-sided die and think it's just bad luck. But rolling a 1 on a 2+ check is a 16.6% chance of catastrophic failure. Nearly 1 in 5 shots will fail this way. It is the inherent risk of low-volume, high-yield weaponry. When you only fire 3 shots, that 16.6% failure rate is magnified immensely compared to firing 40 heavy bolter shots. Only 1 single wound successfully traversed the cascade.
But even that 1 wound should be devastating, right? The weapon does immense damage.
But you are forgetting the defensive profile of the Xenos. We arrive at the save step. The Tyranid monster possesses a 4+ invulnerable save. This is a crucial mechanic. It completely negates the Volcano Cannon's profane armor penetration. It doesn't matter that the Volcano Cannon cuts through steel like butter. The Tyranid has a psychic or biological energy shield that operates on a flat 50% chance to just shrug off the attack.
Right. So even after hitting and successfully wounding, there's a 50-50 chance the damage just disappears into the ether.
Yeah.
In this specific instance, the Xenos player failed that 50-50 save. So the 1 shot finally gets to deal its damage.
Yes, the Xenos player failed it. Now, the final insult, the damage resolution. The Volcano Cannon inflicts a variable damage amount, D12 plus 4 damage. You roll a 12-sided die and add 4. The average roll of a D12 is 6.5. So the expected average damage of a single penetrating hit from this mighty Titan killer is 10.5 damage.
10.5 damage, and a target-heavy biomorph, like a Norn emissary or a Swarm Lord, possesses roughly 14 to 16 total wounds.
Do you see the tragedy of the math now? Do you see the trap? Even failing the 4+ invulnerable save, the expected damage of a single shot is only 10.5. A single penetrating hit mathematically cannot outright liquidate a full health primary monster without extreme variance. You would have to roll an 11 or 12 on that 12-sided die.
Because the guard commander suffered that 16.6% failure on his second wound roll, the mathematical maximum damage cap of his entire shooting phase was hard-locked below the threshold required for a clean execution.
That is incredibly sobering when you lay it out like that. He was relying on this tank to save his line, but the math says it was incredibly unlikely to actually kill a fresh monster in a single turn. It degraded at the hit stage, it degraded at the wound stage, it faced a 50-50 block at the save stage, and even when it got through, the average damage wasn't enough to finish the job. Exactly. The 400-point super heavy failed. It proved exactly why the guard line collapsed. It is a mathematical embarrassment. Relying on a single point of failure against an army with invulnerable saves and high wound counts is strategic malpractice. Moving to Section 5, Role Displacement and Threshold Dilution. Phase 7 and 4. Servitor, tell me what happened to this completely useless, backwards-facing, super heavy tank in Turn 3.
Well, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Tyranid front line reached the guard vehicles. The Swarm Lord, the apex commander of the Tyranid swarm, closed the distance. In the shooting phase, it targeted Penelope the Shadowsword with its psychic biological weapons. Specifically, it shot a torrent weapon at the tank. Because it's a torrent weapon, it hit automatically. The tank failed its armor save against the psychic onslaught. The damage pushed the tank past its remaining wounds, destroying it. And then Contractor JT yelled, "Boom! Will it be an explosion?" He rolled a 6. The massive tank underwent a catastrophic magazine detonation and exploded right there in the guard lines.
Go on. Tell the listeners what that explosion cost the human ledger.
The explosion dealt a flat 7 mortal wounds to every unit within a significant radius. It obliterated 5 of the Tyranid hormagaunts that were swarming it, but the blast radius was massive. Because the guard forces were so bunched up due to the 6-inch deployment zone, it caught their own units. It completely wiped out the human commander's heavy weapon teams, vaporizing them instantly.
I am practically slamming my fist on this desk. Do you comprehend what just happened? I will detail the probability bypass for you because it is the most insidious part of this entire fiasco.
Probability bypass. You mean how the Tyranids circumvented the normal rules of engagement?
Precisely. A standard attack on the tabletop requires a probability cascade. A hit roll, a wound roll, and a save roll. 3 separate bottlenecks where an attack can fail. By utilizing the Swarm Lord's torrent weapons, the Tyranids completely bypass the hit step. Torrent weapons auto-hit. They project raw statistical certainty into the guard's failing armor. They remove the dice from the equation entirely. And the explosion, the catastrophic explosion of the Shadowsword, bypassed all saving throws entirely.
Right, because vehicle explosions deal mortal wounds. For the audience, a mortal wound is exactly what it sounds like. You don't get to roll your tough armor save, you don't get an invulnerable save, the damage just happens directly to your health pool.
The guard's own machinery generated a profane mathematical bypass against itself. It inflicted raw, undeniable mortal wounds on the surrounding guard infantry. The commander literally paid 400 points from his army roster to build a bomb, drove it backward into his own deployment zone, and allowed the Tyranids to detonate it in the middle of his own retreating lines.
It's a horrific image. The very asset meant to protect them became their executioner. But surely bringing a heavy tank to act as a rear guard makes some tactical sense. You put a heaviest armor in the back to absorb the blow while the infantry run forward.
This is what I call role displacement, and it is a fundamental misunderstanding of asset utility. The play on tabletop guard commander presented his heavy tanks as an anvil. He thought putting a Shadowsword and a Rogel Dorn at the rear of his retreating column would act as a screen to block the Tyranids. But against dedicated Tyranid anti-armor melee and mortal wound generation, a super heavy tank is not an anvil, it is a target dummy that detonates upon its own troops.
I see. Because the Tyranids are perfectly equipped to kill big tanks, offering them big tanks doesn't slow them down, it just feeds them exactly what they want to hit.
Exactly. By rushing the deployment zone, the Tyranids severed the guard's ability to remain stationary. The tanks were forced to incur a fatal movement tax just to try and escape, which further reduced their ballistic skill. The artillery and super heavies were displaced into the role of fleeing infantry, a function their massive, cumbersome chases were never engineered to perform. A Shadowsword is meant to sit miles behind the front line and delete targets. It is not meant to run a 100-yard dash against a Jurassic Park stampede. How did the mission end? Give me the final victory point economy. Let's hear the final tally of this bankruptcy. The final turns were, as you might expect, devastating. The Tyranids absolutely overran the retreating columns. The final score of the game was the Tyranids winning with 990 points destroyed, to the Guard's 40 points saved. 990 to 40, it is not even a battle. It is an extermination.
It was. And the specific scoring rules really punished the Guard. The rules stated that Guard units had to be wholly within the escape zone, and they had to be above half strength to score their points. The Tyranids slaughtered almost everything in the midfield. Even the few ragged units that actually made it to the board edge were whittled down below half strength by ranged fire. So despite making it to the escape zone, they yielded absolutely 0 victory points.
I am sighing deeply. I am exhausted by the absolute incompetence of this civilian contractor. This scoring dynamic perfectly illustrates the concept of threshold dilution.
Threshold dilution. Could you break that down for me? It sounds like a banking term.
It is a banking term applied to human lives. The mission parameters essentially weaponize the Tyranids' damage profiles. Think about the math required to deny points. To score, the guard needed units above half strength. Therefore, the Tyranid monsters did not need to waste their time killing an entire 20-man Krieg squad.
Because if the squad drops to 9 men, they are below half strength of the original 20.
Exactly. The Tyranid player only needed to kill 11 models to mathematically delete that entire asset's scoring potential. It is pure overkill inefficiency. A Screamer killer charging into a massive squad of human infantry doesn't need to wipe them out completely. It just needs to push them past that 50% threshold, and suddenly, those remaining 9 guardsmen are mathematically worthless to the objective. They still exist on the board, they can still shoot their last guns, but in terms of the ledger, in terms of winning the game, they have been entirely diluted to 0 value.
That's brutal. So the Tyranid player could just spread his attacks around, kill 11 guys here, kill 6 guys out of a 10-man squad there. He doesn't have to finish his plate, so to speak. He just has to take a bite out of every unit.
Precisely. The guard's physical footprint forced this inefficiency upon themselves. They bled points every time a unit took a localized casualty. It is an asymmetrical disaster of epic proportions. Which brings us, finally, to the corrective phase of this audit. We cannot simply observe failure, we must rectify it. Section 6. The Corrective Ledger. Roster Redesign. Phase 8. Before I tell you how this mission should have been played, tell me how the civilian contractor justified this unmitigated failure. How did they sign off on their video?
Well, at the end of the video, Contractor JT is actually very happy. He seems thrilled with the experience. He says on camera, what a finish, what a game. The Valkyries, the Lighters, they all come down, they pick up the survivors, and they get out of there. Good game, Nick. Well done, Nick. That was a valiant effort. What a crazy narrative game. That was a ton of fun.
I am interrupting you violently right now.
Yeah.
Stop reading that civilian propaganda.
But Senior Auditor, it was a narrative game meant for entertainment.
There is no heroism in a negative ledger. There is no valiant effort when you mathematically sabotage your own forces before the deployment phase even begins. A ton of fun. They call a 990 to 40-point slaughter fun. If I were the Lord Solar of the Astra Militarum, I would have this contractor servitorized and bolted to the hull of the very tank he destroyed. We are going to fix this. Here is the geometric redesign mapped out by the Departmento Analytica. If you ever find yourself in a spatial asphyxiation trap against a high-toughness Xeno swarm, this is how you survive.
I have my stylus ready. What is the first step in the redesign?
Step 1. Asset liquidation. We liquidate the 400-plus point Shadowsword immediately, sell it for scrap, melt down the Volcano Cannon to make hull plating for something actually useful. Its massive physical footprint and single point of failure fed directly into the Tyranids' defensive strengths. It allowed their 4+ invulnerable saves to absorb massive single-shot damage. We remove it entirely from the roster.
Okay, 400 points freed up. What do we spend it on? If we don't have a giant tank, how do we stop the monsters?
Step 2. The Swarm of Steel. We replace the 24-wound hull of a single Shadowsword with 9 7-wound armored Sentinel hulls. We take those points and we flood the geometry of the board with redundant high-mobility walkers.
9 armored Sentinels. But Auditor's Sentinels are light scouting vehicles. Their weapons are nowhere near as powerful as a Volcano Cannon, and they are much more fragile. A Screamer killer will rip a Sentinel to shreds in close combat.
Let me explain the math to you. Since the civilians refuse to learn, and you seem to be struggling with the concept of asset trading. Yes, a Screamer killer will rip an armored Sentinel to shreds. That is exactly the point. When a monster charges a Sentinel, its massive D3 damage attacks will drastically overkill the fragile walker.
Overkill. Oh, I see.
Yes. We weaponize their own overkill inefficiency against them. The Xenos wastes its massive, apocalyptic damage output on a mathematically insignificant target. A Screamer killer hitting a Sentinel with 5 attacks that do 3 damage each is generating 15 points of damage. The Sentinel only has 7 wounds, that is, 8 points of damage that simply evaporate into the ether. If one Sentinel dies, you lose roughly 70 points from your ledger. When the Shadowsword died, he lost 400 points.
And because we run them in small units, or even individually, if a monster kills a Sentinel, the unit is dead, not below half strength.
Exactly. We deny the enemy the partial VP threshold trap entirely. You cannot be below half strength if your entire unit consists of a single model that gets destroyed. The Tyranid commander will face a board swarming with individual, fast-moving vehicle chassis. Their mental bandwidth will shatter, attempting to optimize charge targets, sequence multi-combats, and allocate shots. They will be drowning in target saturation.
That is incredibly shrewd. You aren't trying to outpunch the monsters, you are just feeding them cheap calories so they choke on the math. But Sentinels still die. Eventually they will chew through all 9 of them, won't they? And we still need to get models into the escape zone to score.
Which brings us to the final, ultimate mathematical subversion, the zombie loop. This is where we break the game's geometry over our knee. We shift our operational philosophy to purely awakened armor synergy. We heavily rely on the Astra Militarum reinforcement stratagem for infinite recursion.
The reinforcement stratagem, I know of it. For 2 command points, you can target a regiment unit that was just destroyed and place an identical unit into strategic reserves. But wait, Sentinels have the regiment keyword in 10th edition, don't they?
Yes, they do. When the Xenos inevitably crush a unit of Sentinels, because they will, we expect them to, the Guard commander smiles, spends 2 command points, and brings the entire unit back from strategic reserves. Fully healed, fresh ammunition. And where do units arrive from strategic reserves in the later turns of the game?
They can arrive on any board edge, including the enemy's deployment edge, or in this case, the escape zone board edge.
Do you understand the majesty of it? We mathematically subvert the mission parameters. We bypass the physical geometry of the board entirely. We do not need to walk across the 2-inch cliffs. We do not need to navigate the decorative greenery. The Tyranids try to block the board with their Jurassic Park stampede. Let them. We simply let our frontline assets die, pay the 2 command point tithe, and respawn them behind the Xenos lines directly in the 12-inch escape zone, fully at strength, instantly scoring victory points.
That is a ruthlessly efficient strategy, Senior Auditor. The Tyranid player would be furious. The Xenos wouldn't be able to generate enough mortal wounds or cover enough ground to stop the recursion. They would be marching forward to block a retreat, only to find the retreating army is materializing fully formed behind them.
Of course it is efficient. It is the Departmento Analytica standard. It relies on the ledger, not on hope, not on cinematic throwbacks or bravely running away. It relies on the cold, hard, exploitable reality of the rulebook's numbers. Let them drown in our cold, redundant machinery. That is how you win a war of mathematical attrition.
I have to admit, when you lay it out using the reinforcements loop and the overkill inefficiency, the Tyranid menace suddenly looks a lot less like an unstoppable force of nature and more like a poorly optimized math problem.
Because that is all anything is in this universe. A math problem waiting to be solved by superior accounting.
Auditor, is your console malfunctioning? You stop typing.
Look at this data slate. Look at the high-resolution casualty pick captures from this play on tabletop engagement. Look past the dice and the stratagems for a moment. All those chimeras, torn open like tin cans. The heavy weapon teams, crushed under the hooves of the Crusher Stampede before they could even unlimber their last cannons. The Crew of the Shadowsword, vaporized in an instant by the failing reactor of their own machine, dying not in a blaze of glory, but in a friendly fire mathematical anomaly.
It is grim, sir. The scale of the loss is total.
It is all just futile, isn't it? The screaming Xenos, the fleeing tanks, the exploding super heavies, it's all just another minor data entry in a dying bureaucratic galaxy. The civilian contractors on their video channels laugh and roll their dice, calling it a heroic narrative. They pack up their plastic models and go get lunch. But I sit here, in the bowels of the Analytica, staring at the raw math, and I see the truth of our existence.
Auditor, you're sounding a bit melancholic. Should I requisition a medical servitor?
No. Let the fan hum. Listen to it. It sounds like the grinding gears of the Imperium itself. No matter how bravely the guardsmen ran in that simulation, no matter how desperately they fired their flashlights into the encroaching dark, they are just numbers turning to dust. We're auditing ghosts. Ghostly assets that were written off the moment the Tyranid Leviathan Crusade eclipsed their sky. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the Tyranid biomass. Sometimes it makes all our stratagems, all our clever little zombie loops and geometric redesigns feel like rearranging deck chairs on a sinking transport ship.
But the math, you just prove the math can save them. The Sentinels, the stratagems, we can beat the ledger.
We can beat the ledger today. But tomorrow, the hive mind adapts. It always adapts.
Yeah.
And the ledger demands more blood. If you, the listener, want to survive the grim darkness of this universe, you need to understand the math. Because the math is the only thing that doesn't lie to you. The math doesn't promise you Valkyries coming out of the clouds to save the day to a soaring soundtrack. It only promises statistical decay and eventual zero-sum equilibrium. For the love of the Empire, tap that like and hit subscribe. We need the data. We need every single scrap of algorithmic engagement just to keep the flickering lights on in this miserable sector of the galaxy.
The feed is still live, sir.
The audit is complete. I leave you with this final thought. When you place your favorite, most expensive miniature on the table, ask yourself, are you deploying a hero or are you just deploying a target? Dismissed. Pay your tithes, citizens.